And first of all, many thanks to the Traverse Area District Library for having Diane and I here this evening. And thanks to all of you for coming. I'm always humbled, first, that some of you may have spent your hard-earned money to buy one of my books. And second, that you may have even taken the time to read it. I've been writing in earnest for the last 10 years. I'm a novelist and I enjoy creating characters, settings, and plots that portray the lives of our nation's greatest and frequently our most unsung heroes. I'm speaking of our veterans of military service. I'm also a bit of a romantic, so I frequently wrap a romance around my story. I cherish the time I spend in front of the computer writing, but I also enjoy these opportunities to talk about what I've written or why I've written it. But talking about my writing is a bit different than the writing itself. A fellow writer, Dennis Roth, sums it up well, I think. He says, if it takes a lot of words to say what you have in mind, then give it more thought. So after giving my remarks tonight a lot of thought, my effort is to be both brief, informative, because I want to have time to answer your questions. This is the steamer John A. Dix. In 1871, this vessel was a marvel of shipbuilding technology. At nearly 175 feet in length and 28 feet at the beam, steam generated the power to drive the huge paddle wheel that you see that sets just slightly forward of amidships. She carried a mixture of cargo and passengers. And on the early morning of May 14th, 1871, the Dix was steaming between Point Betsy near Frankfurt and Manistee, Michigan. Just as dark was transitioning to daylight. And that's that time of day when dark shapes suddenly they slowly begin to reveal themselves for what they really are. The crew of the Dix, thinking they were at least 2 miles off the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, suddenly found they had somehow wandered into a dense forest of trees, maples, beech, oak, and hemlock. Dumbfounded, the captain ordered the engine room to come to full stop. They slowed, they confirmed their course. They were where they should be, but what the hell? The bow of their ship, its forward movement ever slowing, it collided with these behemoths. But instead of the ship being bashed about, the giant trees would loll slowly from one side of the ship to the other side of the ship. The crew logicked, the trees weren't rooted. A small relief, yet the captain still feared the stout limbs of any of these trees could foul his water wheel. Somehow he had to navigate out of this, whatever this might be. He had no idea. How did these get here? He must have asked that question 1,000 times. But he couldn't even begin to speculate. All he knew for sure is, I have to get my ship out of here. Now dead in the water, surrounded by these trees, he ordered the engine room to slowly bring the ship back to life. And as the Dix began to move again, he turned from a southerly heading toward Manistee to a westerly one toward Wisconsin. His thought was that this forest cannot possibly reach that far. And lucky for him, he reasoned correctly. To the relief of everyone on board, they managed to break free from their leafy Lake Michigan prison. A few hours later, safely berthed at port in Manistee, Michigan, the Dix's master reported to the Port Authority the trouble he had encountered. The Port Authority was skeptical. They wondered exactly how much the captain might have had to drink. But a few hours later, after the Port Authority corroborated the captain's implausible story, a warning to mariners was issued. It advised vessels transiting along the eastern shore of Lake Michigan between the Point Betsy Light and the Manistee Light to be watchful of floating debris that could stretch as far as 2 to 3 miles offshore, and that warning would remain in effect throughout the remainder of 1871. So the larger question became, how did this forest encountered by the Dix get there? And before I answer that question, let's take a look at this map. It's an old plat map of Portage Lake and its surrounding area. For some perspective on size, the lake itself measures about 2,100 acres, and that's pretty much true of its dimension today. In 1871, Portage Lake was ringed by homesteads, small ones, 80-acre homesteads, many of them given free to veterans of Civil War for their service to the Union. Now, allow me to point out this small squiggle right here. Squiggle. That's a very technical map term. And that squiggle is Portage Creek, a small, shallow stream of water that was, at the time, the only natural outlet between Portage Lake and all of this over here, which is Lake Michigan. For later reference, I also want to point out this narrow isthmus of land that extends from Portage Creek all the way down to the southern boundary of Portage Lake. And then I want you to note the very narrow portion right here of that isthmus. Before I get to the land issues, I want to show you this contraption. It's called a muley saw, and it was used to cut logs into lumber in 1871. In the most modern sawmills of the time, steam was a relatively new force in industry, and it was used to drive the saw's blade. The saw's blade is that vertical steel shaft that you see right there. In less modern lumber mills, however, water wheels were used to drive the muleys. This is one right here. Looks pretty idyllic, doesn't it? But in 1871, Porter Company out of Chicago owned a sawmill similar to this one, located over that little squiggle, Portage Creek. Now, Portage Creek, left alone, was little more than a trickle of water and incapable of driving a water wheel, especially one as large as that one, which would be about the size of the one that was on Porter and Company's mill. So what the Porter Company did was built a dam over Portage Creek. And when that dam was closed, Portage Lake would begin to rise. And it would go up anywhere from 10 to 14 feet. So in the spring, when the lake thawed and the mill began its operation, the flow of the high water behind that dam was regulated, and it provided sufficient force to drive a water wheel, which in turn drove Porter and Company's mills muley saw. It was Porter and Company's dam, as the farmers referred to it, and the rising water level around Portage Lake that became a huge bone of contention between frazzled farmers and big lumber. I refer to the lumber industry as big lumber simply because at the time, there was no business larger or more powerful than the lumber industry in northern Michigan. In 1871, Manistee, Michigan could boast it had more millionaires per capita than any other city in the United States. Little old Manistee. Powerful lumber barons were used to doing whatever they wanted as long as it meant there would be more lumber brought to the marketplace. Lumber camps like this one were plentiful in northern Michigan in those days. And the men who worked out of these camps, well, they were rough and tumble guys. The work was hard, long, and dangerous. How dangerous? Well, just take a look at that picture and let your imagination run away from you. If any one of these guys were to slip down between those logs, there would be not much saving him. Just a quick lesson in how they did it back then. Logs were cut in the winter when the ground was frozen. Sleds like this one were used to pull logs over the frozen ground. Mills that used steam could produce lumber year-round. Many logs, however, reached mills by being rafted down rivers, and that was difficult at best in the deep freeze of a Michigan winter. In the case of water wheel-driven mills, milling operations didn't begin until the spring, and they continued through the fall until ice, snow, and below freezing temperatures would shut them down. At the same time in history, northern Michigan's agricultural future was beginning to blossom. Ulysses S. Grant was president, and he and the state of Michigan collaborated to provide free land to veterans of the war. In 1870, 1871, those vets, now turned farmers, owned the homesteads that ring Portage Lake, and they were about to prove worthy adversaries to big lumber. They were sick and tired of Porter Company's mill closing the floodgates and flooding 10 to 20 acres of their little 80-acre homesteads. And when I say sick and tired, I mean they and their families were literally sick from the flooding. This is a picture taken around 1870 of the floodplain that actually encircled Portage Lake. This floodplain was created when Porter's mill would open the dam's floodgates in the late April, early May timeframe and begin to use the lake's water to drive the mill's water wheel. When they would do this, the lake's level would slowly drop back to its more normal level. And the result was this waterlogged, puddle-plagued ring around the lake. As the summer would grow warmer, mosquitoes, flies, and all those good kinds of insects would breed in the stagnant waters on this floodplain. Farmers and their families suffered from what they called ague. And that's an insect-borne malady very similar to malaria. Angry at big lumber's unsympathetic attitude toward what the farmers felt was a clear encroachment on their rights, they took Porter and Company to court. In 1870, Circuit Court Judge J.G. Ramsdell issues an injunction forbidding the damming of Portage Creek. Here's a picture of the good judge. And in my humble estimation, he is quite a hero. Back then, the rules regarding judges were, shall we say, a little loosey-goosey, less limiting. In addition to being the Manistee County Circuit Court judge, he was also a successful businessman, heavily invested in the lumber industry himself. I'm sure he had lots of friends similarly invested. Yet he did the right thing and made a judgment against big lumber. So you would say, hooray, the good guys won. All is well, right? Well, due to a technicality, the judge's injunction was never served. And big lumber did what it had always done. In the spring of 1871, Porter and Company closed the dam's gates and Portage Lake began to rise right along with the farmers' rage. And this is where the story really gets interesting. Somewhere around May 1st, 1871, 27 farmers band together, determined they are going to dig their own outlet between Portage Lake and Lake Michigan, a replacement stream, if you will, for the dammed up Portage Creek. Recall that narrowest portion of the isthmus, isolating the two lakes from one another? Here it is again. And right about here is where they decide they're going to make their cut. To begin, they build a temporary bulwark right about here on the Portage Lake side of their ditch. It's meant to hold back the waters of Portage Lake while they dig. But what you can't see on this map is the dense forest of trees that extends the entire length of this isthmus and actually carries on around Portage Lake. One of the big things the farmers had to do was clear these forests in order to be able to farm much of their land. Give you an idea of how dense a forest I'm talking about. This is similar to the forest that they had to dig through. And just for reference, here's a man right here. So notice the density and the height and they had to dig through this. It was so dense, they weren't able to use horse or oxen and their plows. They had to dig it with picks, axes, and shovels. It's a mere 500 feet long, 4 feet wide, 2 feet deep. It takes them 2 weeks. They work at night, half of them on one night, the other half the next night, and so on and so forth. Why work at night? Well, I want you to remember there's several reasons. First, think of what time of year it is. It's spring, and their farms were just waking up after a long winter. They had to be farmers by day, excavators by night. Second, they tried to hide what they were doing from the management and labor at Porter's Mill. It didn't work. They were constantly harassed by big lumber, who knew full well what the farmers were up to. On the evening of May 13th, the undone farmers know they are close to being done. So, like most of us, when a hard job is done, they threw a party. They celebrate late into the night, early into the next morning. And when it finally becomes time to pull down their temporary bulwark, men, women, and children troop down to watch this happen. It's still dark. And because their only illumination is lanterns, they have to get close to the bulwark to see anything at all. 3 logs are holding this bulwark in place. And the lake is so high at this point, the water is splashing over the top of the bulwark. No one recognizes the peril therein. Bets are taken as to how many of the logs will be pulled away from the face of the bulwark before it collapses. It doesn't fall until the third log is pulled down. But then, well, then all hell breaks loose. In the matter of about 1 minute, 60 short seconds, their little 4 feet wide, 2 feet deep expands to 100 feet wide and 10 to 12 feet deep, behind a raging torrent of water that sweeps the entire primordial forest in front of it out into Lake Michigan. 100 feet tall trees are swept, roots, dirt, and all, 2 to 3 miles offshore. People scramble for their lives to escape the mad torrent of water. It's a miracle. No one, not even the farmer and his ox who pulled down the bulwark, were swept out into Lake Michigan with the forest. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the channel between Portage Lake and Lake Michigan came to be. Here's a photo of that cut today. And this is after about $20 million worth of work that concluded just about a year ago when the Corps of Engineers dredged that channel. It's now 18 feet deep in the middle. And they replaced the seawalls on both sides, north and south of the channel. So what happened in the immediate aftermath of this historic event? Well, this changed the entire economy of the area. Porter and Company's mill closed, but other steam-driven sawmills sprang up around Portage Lake. The channel made shipping of goods a lot easier. It provided easy access to Portage Lake, and Portage Lake became protected waters. So ships could go into Portage Lake, lay at berth during storms, and even continue to load and unload cargo during storms, something they couldn't do before when they were tying up the docks along Lake Michigan. Here's a picture of a schooner at berth, and what I want you to know here is that is lumber, loaded, probably bound for some place like Chicago. And below that mass of lumber, below the deck of the ship, is probably a mass of lumber at least equal in size to the one that you see on deck. 3-masted schooner. Notice the small distance between the waterline and the top of the gunnel. I don't know about you, but it wouldn't be a thrilling experience for me to be out on Lake Michigan when the gales of November begin to blow in one of these babies. Fruit and other crops were more easily loaded for market. Remember, we were becoming an agricultural area as well as a logging area. And later, right around the turn of the century, the cut opened the area up for tourism. Here's a steamer, likely again coming from Chicago, and it's loaded with tourists to the area who are looking to escape the heat of Chicago by coming to the Portage Point Inn, which opened in 1903. So everything I've covered up to this point is true. But the cut, my book, is fictional. And one of the questions I'm always asked is, where does the history end and the fiction begin? And I've got a really good evasive answer to that question. If I've done my job well as a writer, you as the reader shouldn't be able to tell. The fiction should be woven seamlessly throughout the history, and it should replicate the history of the area perfectly. Now, this next slide is meant to impress you with my intelligence. and it's going to blow you away. These are the three elements of good fiction, and I'm absolutely sure you're all stunned at my insightfulness and originality. Come on, right? Yeah, probably not. These are about as old as the hills. And let me just add that these are listed in no particular order to indicate any kind of priority. In fact, I don't consider any of these to be more important than the other. In equal doses, each is essential to a well-written work of fiction. If a writer fails to develop any of these well, the result will be a loss of interest by the reader. So what I try to do when I'm writing is to make sure that each of these three elements are mutually supportive of the other. So there's a glimpse into what I consider as I'm writing a novel. Now, let's come back specifically to the cut, and I would like to talk briefly about the time period in which the book is set. 1870, 1871 is an important couple of years in Michigan's, and in particular, northern Michigan's history. Three major events happen in fewer than 18 months. First, women, for the first time, are admitted to what are now Michigan State University and the University of Michigan. And that's during the academic year spanning 1870 to 1871. Allow me to point out how progressive a move this was in the Victorian age. The suffrage movement was in its infancy in 1871. For perspective, please consider the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, the one that gave women the right to vote, wasn't even passed by Congress until 1919 and not ratified until 1920. So it took half a century in between women being admitted to our state universities and women getting the right to vote. Our state universities in 1870 and 1871 were 50 years ahead of their time. The second event in May of 1871 is the digging of the cut, and you now know the history behind that historic event. The third event occurs in October 1871, when the city of Manistee basically burns to the ground. Now, there's some things you should know about this event. We all know about the Great Fire of Chicago, Mrs. O'Leary's cow, and all that. But did you know it was the same storm that caused her cow to kick over the lantern and set Chicago ablaze, that also contributed to the blazes that burnt Peshtigo, Wisconsin, Holland, Michigan, Manistee, Michigan, and finally Saginaw, Michigan, to the ground? So the plot of the cut is built around these three events. I've been asked, why write a novel when the history itself is so powerful? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First, I'm a novelist. That's what I write best. That's what I like to write. I love creating characters, settings, and plots that stir my creative juices. Quite honestly, when I'm writing a book, those characters get into my head, and they won't leave me alone until I finish the book. The second reason, I was a history major in college, and I recall my history textbooks being that perfect solution for insomnia. 2 or 3 pages could put me right to sleep, and I liked that stuff. And finally, Elspeth Barstow Cheney had already written a wonderful history of Onekama for its centennial year in 1971. It's called the story of Portage. And when I was asked by the Onekama 150 committee to write something for Onekama's sesquicentennial year, 2021, I wanted to write something that would strike a different note with readers and still portray the fascinating history of Onekama and Manistee County during the golden years of the lumber barons. Okay, there you've had it. If you've read the book, I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't read it yet, then I hope I've provided sufficient inspiration for you to do just that. What I'd like to do now is open this up to your questions, but I want to preface this part of the evening with something I used to tell the great soldiers I was privileged to work with during my Army career. And it's about the subject of questions. It's simply this. The only dumb question is the one you don't take the opportunity to ask when you're given the chance to ask it. So with that in mind, what are your questions? Okay, there's this, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you, buddy.
It's good to see you again.
You too, bud. There she is.
Two things. First, you described the nautical elements very, very well. Do you ever wish they could go in the Navy instead of the Army?
You're asking a guy that graduated from the Naval War College.
Okay, then.
And that 1 year long experience was enough for me to spend with the Navy.
Okay.
It was a great opportunity. I would do it again but at the end of that, I was ready to go back to the big green machine.
Okay. My second question, Portage Lake, like many of the lakes up here, Crystal Lake, etc., are called embayment lakes because over time they were separated from Lake Michigan by big sand dunes and other things like that. A friend of mine is a retired park ranger up here, and he took us to an old 19th century farm near Crystal Lake. And exactly the opposite happened. Instead of this a lumber mill causing the lake to rise, some farmers dug a big channel to irrigate celery crops, not realizing that they were lower than the lake level. And the reason why Crystal Lake is now where it is, about 8 feet lower, and there's a road around it, is because of that celery farm, and you can go visit it. Did you know that story at all?
I've touched on that story. The story I'm more familiar with is in regards to Crystal Lake. And it occurred in the 1873-1874 timeframe, just a couple of years after the cut at Portage Lake opened up that area as dramatically as it did. So what happened was Crystal Lake wanted their own channel to run out to Lake Michigan. And these guys were a little bit like the farmers. They didn't know what the hell they were doing. In fact, those 27 farmers that dug that cut, for the first 48 hours after that opened up, they were really, really fearful that they had really messed things up and that they were going to drain Portage Lake dry.
Yeah.
But it eventually reached its equilibrium, and it's now about the 2,100 acres that I showed you on that old plat map. So Crystal Lake wants to do the very same thing, but again, it was people that they weren't engineers, they weren't hydrologists, they just knew they wanted that channel out to the big lake for many of the same reasons that it turned out it was beneficial to Manistee County. Well, fortunately, they ran into somebody that knew what the heck he was doing, and he said, stop. If you do that, you will drain Crystal Lake completely dry, and all you will have is a huge mud lake. Now, how many of you are at all familiar with Crystal Lake? It makes Portage Lake look like a puddle. It's that big. So what happened there? And again, think about how low the dune is at Onekama. Maybe 10, 12 feet down from the top of the dune to the beach. But as you move north up along M22, by the time you get to Frankfurt, how high are those dunes? They're like 300, 350, maybe 400 feet from the top of the dune down to the lake. All right, so Crystal Lake sets right in that Frankfurt area, and the lake is here at the top of the bluff. The bottom of the lake is right here. Lake Michigan's down here. So gravity is not going to be your friend in this case. And they stopped what they were doing. They realized the disaster that they were on the edge of creating. So, two good questions.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I don't know a lot about it, except it was severe, like the fire in Manistee. It was. But what you have to remember back then, and I don't want to step away from this because we've got some folks on Zoom and they like to see the guy talking. But so what, let me give you a feel for how they cut lumber back then. And there was absolutely no concern for the environment whatsoever. A gang of lumberjacks would go into a 100-acre plot, and they could strip that plot in well less than a month. And the way they did it is a lumberjack would skinny up to the top of a tree, and on his way down, he would cut the boughs off. And those boughs and the top of that tree were just left to lay. As soon as they got that trunk down to basically the bare trunk of the tree, they would cut it off at the ground as close as they could, and they would section it up into those sections that you saw on that horse-drawn sled. And they would haul it off to market, or they would get it to a river where it would be rafted down to a sawmill. So you had all this debris laying around these massive tracts of land that were cleared. One of the things about the summer of 1871, it was a drought summer. So you have all of this tinder dry material laying on the ground, and this storm sweeps out of the Midwest, comes up through Chicago. Now, one of the things you need to realize about Chicago in 1871, what was it built of? You saw that lumber on that schooner? That was probably going to Chicago. Chicago was almost all built out of lumber. And so when that fire broke out, there was lots of fuel to be consumed by that fire. After that fire, Chicago implemented a building code that said your building can only be 50% lumber. The other 50% has to be something non-flammable, AKA concrete. So in Holland, this storm sweeps across from Chicago, coming up in a northeasterly direction. Holland is a lumber town, just like Peshtigo, Wisconsin was, just like Manistee was. The storm, 60-mile-an-hour sustained winds, and full of lightning. There's some rain in there, but the real hazard was the wind and the lightning. And these lightning strikes would come down and they would find all of this tinder dry debris, and it was just like throwing a match on gasoline. And the fire would begin and it would be sustained by the wind. So in all of these towns, the thing that all of these towns have in common is they're lumber towns, right? That's the primary industry going on there. What is a byproduct of a sawmill besides lumber? Sawdust, tons and tons and tons of it. In a 60-mile-an-hour wind, what happens to those piles of sawdust? It gets picked up into the wind, which is full of sparks. And so basically in those towns, the air was literally on fire. Now, the amazing thing about the Manistee fire that distinguishes it from the others is that no one except one elderly gentleman whose name has been lost to history perished in that fire. You know, in Chicago, hundreds, if not thousands of people died. People died in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. People died in Holland. People died in Saginaw. But in Manistee, one elderly gentleman. Absolutely astounding. Just as, so an urban legend I heard when Diane and I moved up to Onekama is that there were dozens of farmers and dozens of livestock that were swept out into Lake Michigan when the cut broke loose and killed. Turns out that's an urban legend. Nobody was killed. There were probably a lot of people that had to go home that morning and clean out their trousers, but nobody was killed. So, excellent question. Did I get around to the gist of? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. What else? David.
I thought one of the coolest things was the description of all the fish that were left. I'd say something about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's still fish in Portage Lake. So especially in the wintertime. If you've seen Onekama in the wintertime, it's like a little village out there, 500 shanties. Yeah, the fish, the lake was full of fish. And the lake was way up when they pulled that loose. And there were a lot of fish that didn't get out. They wound up in those puddles on that floodplain. And they either ran out of oxygen or the puddle dried up and they died. And the farmers used those to fertilize their fields. Not a pleasant task, but it got the job done. Mike.
Just a comment, John, talking about being insensitive to the environment. We have a place on the top part of Lake Michigan, and the lumber people up there would haul in the wintertime, would haul the sawdust out on the lake to get rid of it, thinking it's going to be gone. And it isn't.
Yeah, it's still there.
Oh, yeah. It turned into like black brook and it floats back and forth.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's the story or not, but we've seen it.
Yeah. In that 2 to 3 miles offshore at the mouth of the cut going out into Lake Michigan, there are still logs from those trees that are buried in the sand and the silt on the bottom of Lake Michigan. And every now and then, one of them or a piece of them will wash up onto the shore. I have a magazine rack that I made out of a piece of a log that I think probably goes back that far. Can't prove it, but yeah. Well, listen, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Again, thanks to the library for having us here. But now I have to do the promo. I have copies of all of my books in the back. Books make wonderful gifts for those friends of yours and family who are readers. I am happy to sign that book to whomever you would like me to sign it to. I have the ability to take checks, credit cards, yes, even cash. My lovely bride is my accountant back there. And if you have any other questions you'd like to ask me, please don't hesitate to stop at the table. You don't have to buy a book. Stop and ask me the question. Thanks again.